During the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, the Western genre was the king of Hollywood. In large part, it was for practical reasons initially. Hollywood was surrounded by locations that were perfect for making Westerns. Beautiful backdrops, desert locations. But very quickly, the audiences developed a massive appetite for all kinds of Westerns. You had an entire generation of fans who would eventually go on to become filmmakers who grew up loving Westerns. But by the time of the late 60s, the love for the Western genre had all but dried up. As you had the likes of John Carpenter and other famous directors from his generation starting to make films, the very reason they wanted to make movies in the first place, to make Westerns, was no longer an option. Hollywood had zero interest in financing big Westerns, and the only ones you were getting were low-budget niche Westerns. A lot of the time, the only reason they'd get made is because they'd have a tiny budget or because they had star power. Clint Eastwood made a bunch of Westerns during the 70s and early 80s, and some of them were really successful. But it was the exception to the rule, and it was more to do with his star power. So around about 1984, when Silverado was going into production, there was a lot of fanfare about it. It'd been nearly 2 decades since you'd had a Western with this size budget, this kind of star-studded cast, this ambitious of a production into a Western. 100 horses, 500 cattle, especially when you have later on in the movie a huge stampede sequence. So the public were really excited. The media was really excited. There was a lot of talk that this was going to be the revival of the Western genre. And I think to get an idea of why this film is so beloved with a lot of people, I suppose, like we said at the beginning, you have to transmit yourself back to when this film came out, when it was getting all that fanfare and excitement about this is going to be the big revival of the Western genre. Even though for us it feels a bit paint by numbers, seen it all before, if you were there back then when there'd only been really niche, low budget Westerns for so many years, and finally, for the first time in years, there was a big budget Western that you could go see in the cinema, that was getting all the news. It was the biggest film getting released that week or that month. All the things you'd missed, all the things you'd loved growing up as a kid were back on the silver screen. Shootouts, cattle stampedes, the one-on-one shootout, the two bandits, riding their horses and shooting at each other, robberies, people getting broken out of jail. It hit all those notes that feel familiar to us now, but we grew up in an age where I can just Google some obscure 1930 silent film that comes up in 2 seconds. Back then, if you didn't see it in the cinema when this came out, it was just gone. And then maybe it would come up on TV on one of the 5 channels that was on around then. But if you didn't get it, it was just you didn't see it. So these were precious in a way we just don't get or appreciate. So I totally get why this film would have such a big place in your heart. But for me, as a spoiled 30-year-old who grew up in the noughties, it doesn't fill my heart with anything. It has no place in my heart. I enjoyed it, probably wouldn't recommend it to anyone. Having said that, you did see more Westerns in the 80s after this. Things like Young Guns, which was a big hit, but it was the MTV Western, which I suppose was fun. And I know people have love for Young Guns as well, but I don't think it stands up. 5 years later, Dances with Wolves comes out. And I feel like this is the film that came good on the promise in the build-up to Silverado that the media drummed up and audiences drummed up. Dances with Wolves set the tone for the modern Western. You can see its influences in its kind of naturalistic, authentic approach in Unforgiven, the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, Tombstone. It set the tone for what Westerns would be, and I felt people were able to take Westerns seriously again. It went back to a time when the 40s, 50s Westerns, part of what made them so great was that you could really explore the big ideas of life because you simplified life down to this scale. Small town, not many people in your life, not many options, brutal law and order. And interestingly, considering that Kevin Costner got his big break in Silverado, and that therefore gave him the career which eventually allowed him to be in the position to direct Dances with Wolves, in a lot of ways, Silverado did come good on having a legacy and reviving the Western genre. It's never going to get to its peak, its heyday of the 40s and 50s level of popularity, but even cinema itself is nowhere near its peak of popularity that it had back then. It's too watered down with podcasts and TV and different media content. It gave the foundation for other big, ambitious westerns, which eventually did hit the right tone and did hit the right quality. Dances with Wolves was the highest grossing western of all time. It grossed over 400 million. It won a slew of Oscars. Silverado barely made its budget back. And it was a big budget for the time, especially for a western. So I feel like in that way, Silverado did come good on its promise, just not in the way the fans and the media and the crew and the cast would have hoped.